It's a great privilege for me to have been involved with voluntary assisted dying, and I mean that sincerely. Just Tuesday of this week, I had a gentleman that I know, but not real well, just a friend of mine, I would say, through the Bowls fraternity. He rang up and said, "Mike, I just want to say thank you," and I sort of could see where this was heading. I said, "Why?" What's that? He said, "My wife passed away on Tuesday, but I wanted you to know that she chose voluntary assisted dying, and it was very comforting that she was able to do that." And so from that perspective, I found that really, it's always sad, but it was quite heartening. I had another person 2 weeks ago. I was at a function with my sister, and they were having a bit of a party thing. I was down there with Wayne and my sister Vicky, and a person came up and spoke to me about his wife, who at the age of 54 had chosen voluntary assisted dying 2 weeks earlier. And that's never ever a short conversation. That's one where I sit and listen, and at the end of it, through the tears and whatever, they come out and say, "Thank you so much for that legislation." The hardest one for me was a person just before I went and spoke in Dublin in September of last year. On the Tuesday, I was flying out on the Sunday, and a person said, "Oh, I got this phone message, can you call me back?" And usually when it's that phone message, they want to talk about their mum or their dad or their brother or their cousin or something happening with voluntary assisted dying, or even how they get more information. When I spoke, I rang the guy back. He's 62. I'd known him through local government 20 years ago, and we got on really well. He's a planner. He said, "Mike, I just want to say thank you." I said, "Oh, what's wrong? Or what's happening?" He said, "No," he said, "I'm taking the substance on Sunday." And he's ringing me on the Tuesday. He said, "I just want you to know that I'm so pleased that you got this legislation through." And that's a really difficult, because at the end you don't know, say, "Well, I hope it goes well," or it's hard to know how to sign off, you know. But the point was, he wanted me to know how pleased he was that he had that opportunity to choose. And he said, "The time is right, I can't go on any further. All my family's going to be there, my friends, and I'm saying goodbye." And so it was a nice way for him to say thank you to me for the legislation. But when I say that, it's just not only to me, it's to all the groups beforehand and all the people from Tasmania and the mainland and internationally who fed into the process. And I think that's important. I'll go through that, and if I'll get my trusty assistant over here, Candice. I'm just going to give you a real quick snapshot of what's happening in Tasmania. I actually became a member of the Legislative Council in 2009. Nick McKim introduced a bill called Dying with Dignity. Immediately, Palliative Care Tasmania and the Tasmanian branch of the Medical Association were up in arms about the title of the bill. We want people to die with dignity as well. And so the churches come into it, and initially there was a huge barrier just to that issue. For those who don't know Parliament, it's got to pass at the second reading before it goes into a committee stage in either the lower house or the upper house. Both houses need to pass legislation for it to become law in Tasmania or in Australia, in the Westminster system. And so 1517 passed. Between 2009 and 2013, it was reintroduced again by Lara Giddings, the then Premier, and by Nick McKim. Notice the change of the title. Tasmania was the first group to introduce voluntary assisted dying because they wanted to get away from the argy-bargy with the dying with dignity. So they introduced voluntary assisted dying into making it very clear that it was assisted dying and it was voluntary, both from the health practitioner's point of view and also obviously the person. That didn't pass 13 to 11. I was talking to Lara sometime later, and she said that was the first time in her office in Parliament she ever cried, because she couldn't even get the topic to the table to be debated. So what that means is all the clauses of the bill then get debated and passed, amended and whatever, and you vote on the bill at the end. This bill in 2009 was only 19 pages long. They sent that to a different committee process, even though it's not that, for us to have a look at the bill. And I was one of the 6 people that were asked to do that. The bill was deficient. I could not have recommended that bill, and so the recommendation that went back to Parliament was that the bill was deficient. And so the bill was deficient, so it couldn't have passed. The bill then went in 2016, it was Lara and Cassie. Nick had gone to the Senate. It was defeated 16 to 8. Okay? Yeah. And then in February 2019, I was asked by Dying with Dignity Tasmania, which is our peak body, if I would carry the bill in the upper house if it was passed in the lower house. So we're going to attempt it again in 2019. So they're bringing the same piece of legislation back. And I thought, well, if I'm going to carry a very important bill in the upper house, I need to go and get some more information globally. And so I went on a 2-week fact-finding. I went through to the Netherlands, to Belgium, to Switzerland, to Canada, to Vancouver, then to Portland, and then back. I met 15 or 16 of the world authorities on different pieces of legislation. Because it was really important to me that I knew what I was talking about when you got on up into the house about such an important event. When I came back though, Madeleine Ogilvie had was into the parliament because Scott Bacon retired or resigned. The 16-8, Scott was one of the 8 for it, and Madeleine wasn't. So that would have made it 17-7, with basically the same people, Peter Gutwin, Jeremy Rockcliffe, voting on it again. So I suggested to the Dying with Dignity Tas that I should table the legislation as a private member's bill in the upper house and not in the lower house. Because of my independence, there was less argy-bargy in the upper house about Labor and Liberal voting or Greens voting, and it was a better chance to succeed. Yeah, makes sense. So what I did, now, Dying with Dignity Tasmania, they weren't very happy with me because they thought I was going to introduce the bill in 2019. But one thing in my career I found, when I was mayor or when I was teaching, you need to communicate to people. And most of us, myself included, only ever heard about the Dying with Dignity bill or the Voluntary Assisted Dying bill when it was defeated on the floor of the chamber and it made the paper the next day or it was on the TV. We hadn't really been included. So I said, no, that's not how it's going to work. I wasn't happy with everything in the bill, and so I thought the bill better reflect my understanding of what I think is best law internationally. So that means I need to make some changes. And carrying somebody else's bill is different to introducing your own bill. If I was going to introduce a bill, I want to make certain that everything I introduce is what I believe in. If I'm carrying somebody else's bill up here, I've got to defend what they believe in. So it's a different paradigm. And so that's what I made. So I introduced a draft bill and I said this draft bill is going to go around Tasmania and I'm going to do as many forums and presentations as I can because I want feedback from Tasmanians about what this bill is about. I wasn't precious about how it ended up. I think it started off as 105 pages, it ended up at 180 pages. So I was quite reasoned to that I needed to strengthen the bill. So in February and the first week in March, I did 35 forums to 29 councils. So I went to every council in Tasmania. I doubled up on the islands because if you get to Flinders and King Island, you've got to stay overnight. So I do an afternoon one and a night one, then come back the next morning. And the West Coast, I did a couple because it's such a big area. I actually did a couple on a trial because the first one I presented, I said to my wife, when she came over to listen, I said, how did that go? She said, it was a bit boring, you talk too much. Yeah, right. And it was good because when I got back that night, there was an email, and it was, the PowerPoint I presented was quite dry, but when I got back that night, I had an email from a lady called Gray. These two, it's been so long ago now, the Gray sisters. And this was in Tasmania. They become the voice of the voluntary assisted dying movement. Their mother wanted to access voluntary assisted dying in September, was not allowed to do it. And Jackie and Nikki, before your time too, Jackie and Gray, and I got this email saying, "Dear Mr. Gaffney, this is the last page of my mother's diary." She wrote a diary before she passed away. And it was things like, I hope that the blah, 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 I'm in pain, I would like to have the choice, bang, bang, bang. As soon as I read that, I contacted Jack and said, would you mind doing a voiceover for me in my PowerPoint of your mum's dying wishes? And she said that would be good. And then that changed the whole PowerPoint because it made the focus go back to the person, not the legislation. I had nobody in my family that I had no skin in the game. So from an objective point of view for writing legislation, I was possibly a good person to do it because I didn't have any life experiences that would have impacted me. However, when I went round to do the 35 forums, it was amazing. I had one young couple in New Norfolk come up to say to me, they were 42, 38, had two really young kids. And she said, "Oh, Michael, when do you think this legislation might come into being? You know, when do you think it might be?" And I said, "Look, it's not going to be into being if it gets passed for at least 2 to 3 years." And they looked at each other, and she didn't have that long to live. And she said, "That's fine." She said, "I want to tell my story so that my children have a choice. What can I do?" And I said to her, I said, "Well, look, if you write me your story and send it to me, I'll make sure that every politician in Tasmania gets a copy of that." And I did that at the 35 forums thinking I'd get probably, 25, 30 stories. 109 stories later of people who had experienced great trauma through their family members or themselves or whatever is in this. So every person in all the politicians got a copy of that. I had it on my website for 2 weeks. But it was very painful, and I told people when they sent it to me, it would only ever be there for 2 weeks because I didn't want them reliving the experiences. But that was really important. And then the Greens said to me, "Michael, we want to do something, what can we do?" I said, "Well, how about a petition? That would be good." And so they came up with a petition that we tabled in Parliament. The Tasmanian perspective, I did special interest speeches, submissions, 240,000 pamphlets we letter dropped. And that wasn't always easy, but we got it done. And the cost for our advertising campaign was something like $42,000, which was amazingly minimal cost. I had a farmer on the Midlands come up to see Michael. "My wife's in Campbelltown Hospital, she's not going to get out, she's in care there, she's in pain, what can I do? Here's $1,000. I said, "Well, don't give it to me, give it to Jackie." That family were looking after that. And I'm not sure if the end shot shows that if you travel down the Midlands Highway, there was a big sign saying, "This one, voluntary assisted dying, it's our time." And then when it got passed, we put a sign up saying, "Thank you, Tasmania, for your efforts or votes." And it was a way of saying to that person, "Thank you for what you did." Yep, I have to go through this a bit quickly. So what happened? In 2020, the bill was tabled. Second reading debate commenced in the Legislative Council. We are the only parliament in the world that has had a unanimous decision in either of houses. All right, so in the upper house it was passed 15-0. And you have to understand that when I had that conversation, we had 4 or 5 people in the upper house who were members of the faith. Jo Palmer's parents were missionaries, so she found that really difficult. But I suppose I got in as many people as I could to come and brief people about it. It then passed 19-6 in the lower house, and we had people who had, for the last 3 times before that, previously voted against it. And I said to Jeremy Rockcliffe, and our parent, I said, "Jeremy, what?" And his mum's a palliative care nurse. And I said, "What changed?" He said, "Michael, overwhelmingly the amount of people that spoke to him about it were in favour of people having the choice." And that was my point of view. I don't know whether personally I could actually say I wanted to do voluntary assisted dying if I was eligible. I'm not sure if I had that courage, but I think people should have the choice to do it. And that was my mantra all the way through this. Thanks, Candice. Oh, go back, sorry. Gutman was pretty smart here because he then said to his cabinet, "Oh yes, but we're going to send it off to a independent review." And I thought, "Oh no, this is to derail it." And I said to Jeremy, "Why has he done that?" And he said, "He's done that because in the cabinet at that time, 6 of the ministers were 6 of the ones that had voted against it. They weren't in favour for it. So the only way they could do it was if they send it off to the university to have an independent report, then they would be satisfied they'd done everything they could." On the day I introduced the bill in September, in the late August, the government put out a 3-page letter with 33 dot points saying why they wouldn't support the bill. And I received that on the day I tabled it, about 15 minutes after all the parliamentarians got that. I rang Jeremy, who was Deputy Premier at the time, and said, "Jeremy, what's going on? Are you guys trying to scupper this bill?" He said, "Come for a coffee." Went for a coffee. He said, "Michael, you have to understand, we sent this out to all of our departments, all of our ministers. We said, try and pull apart all of the things you could to do with this bill so that it's all on the table and we can address it." So for example, in my first draft of the bill, I had within 12 months of the bill passing, the implementation period, it should have been able to be accessed by Tasmanians. The health department said we can't do it within 12 months, we want 2 years. So an amendment I put in was 18 months. So every point that they raised, I worked on amendments so that when it got to the table to be debated, they'd say, well, we want it to be this drug. And I said, well, no, it's this one, and the one you wanted. So you have to work around amendments to be it. On that one, and I went around to a lot of the forums. One doctor, a female doctor, stood up at Riverside and said to me, it's funny how you can remember people and places, but she said, what's in the substance? And because in the bill it just says a VAD substance. And I said, well, I don't really know. I'm a person who's politician bring it in, I'm not a doctor. She said, well, we should know what's in the substance. And you don't put that information into legislation. You don't want the everyday person to read it and say, oh, by the way, if you get this and this and put it together. But what happens with the substance, the first one knocks you out, the first substance, as if you were going into the doctors for any operation that you'd be knocked out, and the second one stops the heart. So that's how it operates. But you don't put it into legislation because next month or 2 months from now or 2 years from now, they might find another drug that is perhaps even better than the one they're using. Not that I think that would happen. So you don't want to have that into legislation because once it goes back to the legislation, you open up a whole range of things. The Netherlands Act, which was in 2002, is about euthanasia, and I'll come back to that. They can't afford to make many amendments to their legislation because it's a balance of power in the government, in their parliament. If they introduce the bill to make a lot of legislations, they could actually lose that capacity. So in some places, it's a pretty fine line. Okay, so they released the review, royal assent on the 22nd of April, so it commenced on the 23rd of October in 2022. So it sounds like quite a lengthy period, but with a piece of legislation so sensitive this, it had failed 3 times in the past. In South Australia, it had failed 16 times. So it's only on the 17th time. Victoria was first, WA was second, we were third, then Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales, and ACT just got it in. The only territory, or the only place in Australia is the Northern Territory. And yet they had it in 1997. And if you've seen the last Taxi to Darwin, or the last Cab to Darwin, that film, that's about that. And 4 people accessed it. But a Victorian politician thought, hang on, territories don't have the right to make legislation regarding health, only states. And so therefore, constitutionally, they didn't have the power. So in 1997, 1998, that was withdrawn. And so therefore, it was failed to continue. So at the moment, the Northern Territorians are fighting to try and get that up and running. How the ACT, and theirs starts in 2025, November this year, they had to go back and they had to make a law for territories to have the right to introduce legislation that had been previously part of the Commonwealth Constitution. So that's how that changed. Okay. Oh, 140 forums and presentations. This is my 140th today. So I thought you'd like to know that. So that's yeah, it's interesting, and it's been a good journey. And so I did one a couple of weeks ago to the Justice Society, the Peace Society in Devonport, because JPs are allowed to sign the form. They wanted to know how that worked. And I've said to somebody before, I think Reno said, I've presented to lawyers, to nurses and doctors, to an environmental conference. I thought, why did you want that? And they said, well, you're looking at something in a new way, and we want our scientists to look at issues in new ways as well. So it's an example of the thinking. Okay. All right, very quickly. There's a primary medical practitioner, that's your doctor. And doctors don't have to be involved. They only have to be involved if they choose to. They've done the training, they've had so many years of experience. Usually the person who you have a relationship with is your doctor, is the one that you would possibly, if you were going to make that decision. They have to make sure that you're eligible, and there's 5 categories or 5 criteria for that. You've got to be 18, you've got to have been a resident in Tasmania, and I'll come back to that one. You've got to have decision-making capacity, you've got to be intolerably suffering, and there's a 5th one I'll come back to. The consulting medical practitioner, if your PMP says yes, you're eligible, Then you go away, that's your first request. If you then want to go to the second request, you come back, yes, I want to go through with it. It then goes off to the CMP. Now it's interesting, studies have shown that 80% of people who are eligible for the PMP don't come back. And it's because they have peace of mind. They have peace of mind that I'm eligible for voluntary assisted dying from one doctor. If it gets too painful or I want to go, I just have to go and then request a second request to get a CMP, consulting medical practitioner. Okay, and then if I want to continue through with that, because you can pull out at any time, you get an AHP. Now the AHP, administering health practitioner, that's important because usually it's the PMP. Usually your primary medical practitioner, the doctor who starts it, will follow the whole process. But when I was in Halifax, I met with Jocelyn Downey, who wrote the Canadian legislation, and I've got to slow down. I arrived from Zurich that morning. I met with Jocelyn. She said, "Oh, you can take you for a tour." I said, "No, I want to talk to you about your bill." And they call it MAID, Medicinal Assistance in Dying, MAID. And they say anybody who's taken VAD, it's an event. So that's how they term it. So I'll use those terms now. And I spoke with Jocelyn for 5 hours. I went through everything she'd gone through in Canada, and a lot of I have to say, some of my thoughts have been influenced by the Canadian legislation, because I was so amazed at the work that she's done in that field. I went back to the hotel. It must have been 3 or 4 o'clock, and I wasn't ready to go to sleep. I said to the young guy, I said, "Have you got some place around here that plays a little bit of music or whatever? I'd just like to have a drink and before I go to bed." And the person, and I always remember it was like our equivalent to Molly Malone's. It was Naughty Nellies, just the other way. And he was a band playing, Irish band and stuff. And I went down, sat down, asked the barman, "What's the local beer here?" And a guy, a big Canadian guy, sort of just moved on over and said, "Oh, recognise your accent, where are you from, blah, blah, blah. What are you here for?" And I said, "Oh, I'm here meeting Jocelyn Downey." He said, "Jocelyn Downey, the lady who's written our legislation?" I said, "Yes." And I could see this tear welling up. He was a big fisherman. I reckon he would have been early 60s, maybe middle 60s, big guy. And I said, "Oh," he said, "I've got a story for him." And I thought, "Hello." And so he said, in January of that year, his dad had very bad cancer and was dying, and was qualified for MAID and was able to, also had the onset of dementia. And so what happened, he lived 3.5 hours north of Halifax in Nova Scotia, 3.5 hours north. The doctor and his wife, who was also a doctor, both doctors are travelling up with the substance so they could take that on the Sunday with all the family present. On the way up, taking the medication, they were both killed in a large truck accident. All right. It took 10 days for a substitute physician or practitioner to come up with the medication. The female doctor said to his father, "Oh, you realise what will happen when you take this substance?" And he said, "Oh, I'm going to live forever." His dementia had got, so he was then not eligible for MAID. And the big guy, tears, he said, "It was the worst 5-6 weeks of my life," and it's quite an aggressive dementia. But he said, "My wife is Roman Catholic, she didn't understand. I moved in with my dad into a 2-bedroom unit, but because of the dementia and he was a smoker," he said, "I'd wake up and dad would be lighting matches and tissues all over the place. And the last 5 days," he said, he was in a great pain. And he said, if there had been some system that could have bypassed that, and this is hitting to the core of it, and that's why in in Tasmanian legislation, the AHP can be a registered nurse. We're the only state in Tasmania or in Australia where that happens. You can have a nurse practitioner in WA and in Queensland, but I introduced registered nurses to be able to do that. Because when I was doing the forums, I had a lot of palliative care nurses come up to me and say, quietly, "Michael, I hope you get this through. It's really important." And they felt as though they couldn't speak loudly, but they'd seen what had happened in their care, and they knew that it was the right thing to do. And so I introduced, because I think nurses actually do it, sorry, the doctors in the room, I think nurses do that better, in the fact that they are there when they do know the medication, they do know how to safely, they have to do the training. And it's pleasing to know, and we'll come back to it, that we've had over 50 of our nurses, palliative care nurses, do the training in Tasmania. Okay, let's keep going on. Of interest, I include the word injury in the definition. We're the only one that has that. I read a case in Wales where a 23-year-old rugby player was picked up, slammed into the ground, became a quadriplegic. And so he couldn't kill himself. He had no movement. They kept intravenously feeding him. He had no capacity to not do it. And his parents and his girlfriend said, look, just give it 6 months. Just give it 6 months and we'll see how you feel. And that 6 months he said, I want to die. He said, I can't live like this. So he went to Switzerland, to Zurich, to where I travelled to, and it's called Dignitas there, and was able to pay the money and have the have the event. But that's why I thought injury, it's intolerable suffering to the person. It doesn't mean that it has to be, he couldn't feel anything. It wasn't a physical suffering, but it was a mental suffering. And so I included that. This one, I didn't have a time frame in the original draft of the bill. I didn't have 6 months or 12 months. The reason I didn't have it, I think it's the measure in suffering. It doesn't matter how long you're going to live for. And that's hard for doctors to diagnose. But it was introduced, and the will of the Parliament is there are so many amendments. In fact, one religious group comes and said, over 200 amendments to this bill, it shouldn't go through. I had a commissioner of voluntary assisted dying. The Labor Party wanted to commission. I just was going to have one person with a board. They wanted to commission. So the word commissioner came up 132 times in the bill. So when they said over 200 amendments, 132 of those amendments was from the word commissioner to commission. So it was just a play on words. And in Victoria and WA and other places, they only have VA training course is if the commissioner has consult with the medical practitioners. Now I didn't think that was right because we have nurses involved, we have people with the public guardian, we want psychiatrists and psychologists as to the suitability of the course. So the course is much broader here in Tasmania. Our modules are good. In Belgium, their doctors, their trainee doctors going through there, they actually do their courses as they go through as units, as part of their training to deal with grief and dying. I think that's something that hopefully here in one day we're working with the UTAS to be able to do that, so as actually part of their course. I was travelling back over the lakes, and when I was doing this, I came over the lakes because I had 45 minutes where I couldn't be contacted by the phone, and that was nice. And I remember coming past Elizabeth Town, I was listening to the radio, and I heard this insurance person saying, oh no, we shouldn't support this bill because if you commit suicide, then you're not going to be eligible for your insurance. And I pulled over the side of the road, rang the station, they knew who I was. I said, look, I just need to, back then it was clause 136 because we had some additions. I said, for the purpose of the law in the state, a person does not die by suicide. I think it's really important. The next one is, a doctor said to me, Michael, suicide is the choice between life and death. However, voluntary assisted dying is the choice between two deaths. And I think that when he said that to me, that really, a light bulb actually came on. Because the people in, it's interesting, when the Twin Towers happened and people were jumping out of the windows, the coroner there did not say they died by suicide. They wouldn't put that in. They changed their legislation so it was a death. It wasn't suicide because it was a choice of two deaths. I'm either going to get killed or I'm going to jump and hopefully there's a chance. This one I think is really important, and you will hear people who are advocates. They'll call it assisted suicide, assisted euthanasia. Euthanasia, I mean, that's an interesting one because that's a term we've heard in the past. And people say to me, yeah, look, we wouldn't let my animal suffer like that. Why would we? Yes, but when you take the dog or the cat to the vet and it's euthanized, the dog or the cat don't have a say in it. It's done to them. Voluntary assisted dying is where it's purely determined by the person, all the way through the legislation. It's written so that the person is the core individual at the centre of it. And that was done on purpose, so that if you're in that situation, you start reading the bill from the start, you go through and you'll be bored, but you start reading it and you go through it and it's all about you. And then it's about the other people, okay? And so if we go on quickly, 6 months from the commencement of the Act, there was an operations point of view. I wanted to see how it was working. And I think that's really important. I put that into the legislation. 3 years after the Act, which will be in November of this year, 2025, I wanted there to be a review. Now, every other state has a review after 5 years. Most legislation's 5 years. But I thought with this one, there were things happening nationally and internationally that we need to put into our bill. Andrew Denton said to me, because I had some things I had in the bill that didn't get passed, he said, Michael, 80% of something is better than 100% of nothing. And if you think about it, it's true. I could have stuck to my guns with some of these, like the 6 months and the 12 months, or I had a clause in there where a committee would go out for 3 years and come back to the Parliament about people under the age of 18 being able to access voluntary assisted dying. You know, so, and that didn't get through because it was pretty much on the fence. And so what this review does, we'll look at the operation, the scope of this Act, and the potential scope of this Act. Because the scope of this Act, if that changes, in 5 years' time, that becomes the potential scope of the Act. So you have to rewrite into it. So things, the discussion, debates about decision-making capacity, about dementia, about that is happening worldwide at the moment. There was one in Canada where a grandmother had dementia. She wanted to get through to the Christmas because she loved Christmas with the family, but she actually had the event in November because she was frightened that she wouldn't have had decision-making capacity by the time she got to December. And there was outrage about that, being forced to make that decision. But in talking to doctors, there's an ethical decision too about somebody who doesn't have capacity saying, yes, I'm comfortable for somebody else to make a decision for me. And I've spoken to quite a few doctors in the field, and that's something that we have to come to terms with. Okay, let's keep going through. I'm just going, this is very quickly, keep going all four of them, Candace. There are 4 parts. There's the VAD Commission, which is the board that oversees. All the paperwork's got to go through there, and we've got to have checks and balances in anything, especially something such as this. There's the pharmacy service. These guys are fantastic. They're the ones. In Tasmania, you can also privately self-administer. You don't have to have a health practitioner available or there. When I first had the bill from 2016 from Dying with Dignity Tasmania, you always had a health practitioner at the event. And I thought, well, that makes sense. And we've called it doctors or nurses because an AHP can be a nurse or a doctor. And I thought that made sense. And I had a lady in Devonport at function, and she was an elderly lady. She said, I don't want a doctor within 50 miles of me because I don't trust them. Well, a valid point. Valid point. I thought, And so I thought, well, we could do this privately self-administered, because if you've obviously qualified or eligible to pass for VAD. If you have a contact person, you have to take the medication. If you don't want to have a doctor or a nurse present, you shouldn't have to. And so we can do that here in Tasmania, and they can in Victoria. I forgot the story I told you about the substance, because I got short track. At the end of that Riverside where the doctor said, you should know what's in the drug, I had this vet come up to me and say, a little old guy said, Michael, he said, don't worry about her. I've got enough stuff in my cupboard that will kill 12 bulls. And so you have to weigh it up. And it was gorgeous how he just got up to say, good on you, but so fair enough. The health service is a clinical service. This is where Dr Keith McArthur, who is going to be speaking about the PowerPoint after I finish here in a few minutes, that's where he'll talk about dementia. But his role was this, and he was helping doctors do the training, he was helping doctors be involved, helping people, the navigation service and the cards and that up there, help you through. So if you think you go to the links, I can't read all this, you don't have to. You just go to the navigation service, they'll talk to you, they'll come and see you, they'll visit you, they'll want to understand your issues, your concerns. They'll sit, if your doctor hasn't done the training, doesn't want to be involved, they'll find a doctor who will assess you, and they'll find a second one, whatever. They walk you through the whole process. The pharmacy service, they will come and see you, make sure that you know what you understand, what the obligations are, all that. And the only contact I've ever had with people, they've been so pleased with the service they've received. On the other side, some of the doctors and that, we've got to fine-tune the paperwork. They say it's really, and we don't have a portal in Tasmania. I'm battling this one at the moment. Every other state has a portal. We don't. We do it by email and forms, you know, that sort of thing. And doctors are repeating what they have to do, and I'm fighting that one at the moment with certain people. Okay, we go to the next one. This was between between October and June, the first year, there were 25 deaths. Between July the 1st and 30th of August, there are another 75 deaths. So that makes 100. Now I know there's over 160, 170 people in Tasmania, and we'll see that report in September. And have a look there. 50 doctors who are willing to be PMPs, 30 more registered nurses. Up there we had 23. So the nurses who have registered have wanted to do that. In contrast, in 1997, Oregon, 3.24 million, there were only 4 physicians involved in the first years of dying of death of DDDF. So our doctors want to do it. There's some issues there as well. It's not, and this is not to sound callous, but there's not the required funding for a doctor because it's 1 visit or 2 visits, which is X amount of dollars, but they could be there between 10 and 12 hours, depending on how long they want to talk on that with you. And so it's nothing to do with funding, but there's some of them saying, I can't do more than 1 or 2 a year because I've got to keep my practice going. And that's an issue that we'll deal with. Okay, let's go on past that one, Candice. I suppose in the end there was a lot of media coverage, and that was a good thing. And this was what was going on at Hobart. They had a lot of these volunteers, and we got the final vote in the last one, Candice. And this is when I was talking to you, Dan, because when I had all those signs put up all over the place, I thought, thank you, Tasmania, together we made it happen. You have to be able to say to people, well done. And it wasn't always easy. I remember, and then I'll go on to Keith. I remember one situation, I was travelling back from Hobart, a lady rang up on the phone and said, Michael, my mother's just had a 3rd bout of breast cancer, and my wife was experiencing 3 rounds in 21 days. She had 3 operations for breast cancer. At the time, I pulled over to the side of the road and I just burst into tears because it was right at that time where it was really intense. You know, I sat there, and 20 minutes later that lady rang back to see if I was all right. And I didn't even know who she was, you know, but she rang back to say, are you okay? Is there anything I can do? And I thought that was really nice because whilst you go through these things, there are other people going through a lot of other worse things, but at the end of the day you think, yep, I think I've done something that's special and that people will improve on, and people will say, we're pleased that legislation's there so that we have the choice.